The rehearsal dinner was supposed to be the easy part. That's what my future mother-in-law had said when she booked the private dining room at Rosewood, one of those old Chicago steakhouses where the lighting is dim and the leather booths smell like money and tradition. 40 guests, a fixed menu, open bar. My job, she'd said, was simply to show up and be gracious. I'd been showing up and being gracious for 2 years. I was good at it. My name is on the door of a small but growing interior design firm I built from scratch in River North. I'd signed my first lease at 26 with savings from 3 years of 60-hour weeks. By 31, we had 7 employees, a waitlist of clients, and a feature in Architectural Digest's Midwest edition. I say this not to brag, but because it matters to what happened next. My accomplishments were the reason his family tolerated me. They were also, I would later understand, the reason they needed to contain me. My fiancé, I'll call him my fiancé, because that's what he was for one more night, stood across the room talking to his college friends, laughing that easy, open laugh I'd fallen in love with. He looked at home here. He always looked at home in rooms like this. That was one of the things I'd loved about him, his comfort in his own skin. His family had given him that, I thought, that unshakable sense of belonging. I should have recognized it earlier for what it was. Not confidence, insulation. His aunt tapped her champagne glass and the room quieted. I smiled, expecting the usual toasts, the gentle ribbing, the sentimental stories about him as a kid. Instead, his older brother, 10 years his senior, already silver at the temples and accustomed to command, stood up and smoothed his jacket. What he said next I will remember for the rest of my life. He looked directly at me when he spoke, not at us, at me. He said our family had spent a long time building something worth protecting. He said that meant everyone who entered it had to understand their role. He said marriage, in his view, was not a merger of equals but a structure, like a house, and every house needed a foundation and a roof. The men in their family provided the roof. The women were the foundation. He smiled at me then, warm as a closing argument. I look forward, he said, to seeing you step into that role. Mum could really use help managing the household calendar and the family accounts going forward. You have a gift for organization and design. Those skills translate beautifully to keeping a home running the way ours always has. We're excited to officially welcome you into that. The room was quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a pause, but the breathless quiet of 40 people waiting to see what I would do. I felt my future mother-in-law's eyes on me from across the table. Her expression was perfectly pleasant. Her chin was tilted forward almost imperceptibly, a conductor waiting for the orchestra to follow her lead. I set down my wine glass. I turned to my fiancé's brother, and I asked pleasantly and clearly enough for every person in that room to hear, "When you say family accounts, could you be more specific? Are we talking about your parents' household budget, their personal calendar, their social correspondence? Because I want to make sure I understand the full scope of what you're describing." His smile didn't move. "It's what the women in our family do," he said. "It's how we've always done it." I nodded slowly, and then I turned to my fiancé. I said his name. He looked at me, and in the half-second before he arranged his face into something reassuring, I saw it. The flicker. The "please don't panic," the "not now." I asked him, "In this model your brother just described, what will your specific contribution to our household be? Beyond income, because I also earn income, what will you personally manage, organize, coordinate?" The silence stretched into something physical. He said, "We can talk about this later, okay? Let's just get through tonight. Get through tonight." I picked up my purse from the hook under the table. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. I said, "Please everyone enjoy your evening," and I walked out of Rosewood through the revolving door and into the cold October air of Michigan Avenue. He texted me before I reached the corner. That was incredibly embarrassing. "Call me." I got into a cab. I watched the city slide past the window. I didn't call him. My apartment was a third-floor walk-up in Wicker Park that I'd renovated myself, or rather, designed myself and managed the renovation of myself 2 years before I met him. The floors were white oak. The kitchen had unlacquered brass fixtures I'd sourced from a salvage yard in Indiana. I'd chosen everything in it deliberately, carefully, the way I made every decision. It smelled like the candle I always burned when I needed to think. I lit it now. I changed out of my dress and sat at the kitchen island with my laptop and a glass of water and a legal pad. I didn't feel hysterical. I felt very, very awake. My phone was building up messages. I turned it face down. I opened a new document and titled it, Things I Know for Certain. The first thing I wrote down was about the condo. 18 months earlier, we'd decided to buy a place together. The market was competitive, and I'd been the one with the down payment ready. $95,000, saved over 6 years, sitting in a shelter savings account I'd opened the week I got my first real paycheck. He'd contributed $12,000, a mix of a bonus and what he described as help from my parents. I hadn't asked for details. I loved him. I trusted him. We were building something together. The closing had been handled by a real estate attorney, a longtime family friend of his, as it happened, who worked out of a loop office and wore bow ties and spoke very fast, and called everyone by their first name with the familiarity of someone who expected to be liked. I remembered signing a lot of documents. I remembered being told the title structure was standard. I remembered thinking that word, standard. I opened my email and searched for the closing documents. I found the PDF. I opened it. I wasn't a real estate attorney, but I'd worked with enough contracts in business to read carefully. The vesting language was on page 4. I read it twice. Then I called my accountant's wife. She was also my closest friend from college, and she had been a real estate attorney for 8 years before she moved to a boutique firm that handled financial disputes. It was 11:30 on a Thursday night. She answered on the second ring. I said, I think something is wrong with the deed on the condo. She said, tell me everything. I told her about the rehearsal dinner first. She was quiet while I talked, which meant she was taking notes. When I finished, she said, okay, that's alarming, but not legally actionable on its own. Now tell me about the deed. I read her the relevant clause. There was a pause. She said, send me the full document right now. I emailed it. I heard her keyboard. 3 minutes passed. She said, this is a tenancy in common with a management clause. You each own a percentage interest, and based on the contribution amounts you described, his percentage is listed at 50%, which is already off given your contributions, but here's the bigger problem. The management clause grants him unilateral authority over decisions regarding the property, including leasing, refinancing, and sale. Your consent is listed as advisory, meaning legally he doesn't need it. I said advisory. She said, you have a financial stake in the asset but no control over it. This is not standard, and no competent attorney who was actually representing your interests would have let you sign this without flagging it. This looks like it was designed to give him, and by extension his family, if they have any involvement in his finances, leverage over your primary asset. The kitchen felt very still. I said, what do I do? She said, first, don't sign anything else. Second, don't say anything to him about this tonight. Third, I need you in my office at 8 tomorrow morning. Bring everything, the full closing package, the bank statements for the down payment, anything that shows your contribution. Can you do that? I said I could. After I hung up, I sat for a while with the legal pad in front of me. I wrote down everything I could remember about the closing day. What he'd said about the attorney, how quickly the signing had moved, the way the attorney had glossed over the vesting clause by saying it was just the language we use. I wrote down the detail about his parents contributing to his portion of the down payment. I wrote down a question I hadn't thought to ask until now. Did his family have any financial interest in the property? My phone lit up. His mother. Sweetheart, I hope you're just having a little moment. These big transitions can feel overwhelming. We'll see you tomorrow for the final dress fitting, 10 o'clock. Sleep well, our little moment, the final dress fitting. I turned the phone face down again. I didn't sleep much. At 6 in the morning, I was already dressed, already at my kitchen table, with every document I could find organized into a folder. I took a photo of my savings account statements showing the $95,000 transfer. I found the email chain from 6 months ago where he'd written, just so you know, my parents are going to help with my share. They want to be involved in setting us up. I had not understood at the time what being involved meant. My friend's office was in the West Loop, clean lines and good coffee, the kind of place where serious things got handled seriously. She had a second attorney with her, a colleague who specialized in property disputes. They'd both read the deed before I arrived. The first thing she said when I sat down was, we found something else. She turned her laptop toward me. She'd pulled the Cook County property records. The condo appeared. The deed appeared. And below the deed, recorded 3 days after our closing, was an addendum she hadn't seen in the original documents I'd sent, a supplemental agreement between my fiancé and a family LLC called Hartwell Property Holdings. I stared at it. She explained, "This agreement grants Hartwell Property Holdings a right of first refusal on the sale of the condo at a purchase price to be determined by a designated appraiser of their choosing. It also includes a clause that in the event of, quote, dissolution of the primary partnership, meaning if we broke up or divorced, the LLC had the right to purchase my interest at original contribution value, not market value, not appreciated value. What I put in, I said his family has an LLC. She said yes. And it appears to have been registered 8 months ago, 2 months before we started house hunting together. The math of it landed slowly. They had built the structure before I was even in the room. His parents' contribution to his down payment wasn't generosity, it was investment. They had put their money into a property they had quietly arranged to control, using my larger contribution as the financial foundation, and I had signed the documents without understanding what I was signing because the attorney presenting them was their attorney, not mine. I said, "How do I fix this?" She said, "We send a demand letter today. We allege fraud in the inducement you signed based on a material misrepresentation of the title structure. We demand he cure the title within 48 hours by removing the Hartwell right of first refusal and converting the deed to a true joint tenancy with right of survivorship and equal management authority. If he refuses, we file suit. We also freeze the joint checking account you mentioned. Do you have majority access?" I said the account required both signatures for transactions over $500, but that I was a co-owner and could request a hold. She said, "Do it now." I called the bank from her office. I requested a temporary freeze on activity pending a legal dispute, which they were required by federal law to honor while they investigated. I heard my friend typing while I was on the phone. When I hung up, she slid a document across the desk. The demand letter. It was addressed to him, to the Hartwell Property Holdings LLC, and to the law office of the attorney who had handled our closing. I said, "Is he going to be blindsided by this?" She paused. She said, "That depends on what he knew." I thought about the flicker in his eyes at the rehearsal dinner, the "not now." I said, "Send it." She sent it at 11:45 in the morning. By noon, my phone was generating heat from the missed calls. I didn't answer any of them. At 12:30, a text came through from a number I didn't recognize, and then I realized it was his brother. "You need to stop this right now. You have no idea what you're starting." At 1:15, another from his mother. "I don't know what your friend has told you, but she is making a terrible mistake, and so are you. Call me." At 2:02, one from him. Not a calls this time. "A text Emily, please. This isn't what it looks like. My family was trying to protect the investment. They were worried about what would happen if things didn't work off. They weren't trying to hurt you. Please let me explain." I read it 3 times. What would happen if things didn't work out? He'd known. Maybe not every detail, maybe not the Hartwell LLC specifically, but he had known there was a structure in place. He had let me walk into that closing and sign those documents while knowing there was something underneath them designed to limit my rights. I texted back 4 words, "Talk to my attorney." My friend called at 3. She said, "His family's attorney just reached out. They're calling it a misunderstanding. They're claiming the management clause was standard language their attorney uses and wasn't intended to disadvantage you. They're offering to remove the right of first refusal clause from the Hartwell agreement as a gesture of good faith." I said, "Just the right of first refusal, not the management clause?" She said, "Correct." I said, "No." She said, "I was hoping you'd say that. Counteroffer goes out in 20 minutes. I drove home. My fiancé was sitting on the front steps of my building when I pulled up. He looked like he hadn't slept, which was fair because it was 3 in the afternoon and I also hadn't slept. He stood up when he saw me. He said, "Please just come inside and talk to me." I said, "This is my building. I'll go inside." "You're not coming with me," he said. "I know how this looks." I said, "Do you?" He said, "My dad was trying to protect me. If things had gone wrong, He stopped, he tried again." He said, "They've seen it happen. Friends of theirs, marriages that fell apart, and the wife walked away with assets the husband's family had built for generations." I said, "I want you to hear what you just said." He was quiet. I said, Your family built a financial structure to prevent me from ever having equal control over an asset I contributed 88% of the purchase price for. They did it through an attorney who was supposed to represent both of us, but was actually working for them. They buried the Hartwell agreement in the post-closing records where they hoped I'd never look. And you are standing in front of my apartment describing this as your father protecting you from me. He said, "That's not." I said, "We are done. The engagement is over. You'll be hearing from my attorney. Please don't contact me again directly." I went inside. I didn't look back. The next 48 hours were a negotiation conducted entirely by my friend on my behalf. I unplugged from my phone except for her calls. I worked. I went to my studio and I looked at paint samples and sourced tile and answered emails from clients. And I let the ordinary business of my work anchor me while the other thing ran its course. What happened in those 48 hours? His family's attorney made 4 separate offers, each one incrementally more conciliatory than the last, the way people negotiate when they know they're losing. The final offer, which came in at hour 43, was a full conversion of the deed to a true joint tenancy, dissolution of the Hartwell agreement, and a payment to me of $22,000 representing the difference between my contribution and a true 50-50 split of the down payment, plus 6 months of accrued appreciation. My friend called me when it came in. She said, "This is a good offer." I said, "It's a fair offer. But I also want a written statement from him acknowledging that the original title structure was designed without my full informed consent." She said, "They'll resist that." I said, "I know, they resisted it for 6 hours, then they stopped resisting. I don't know exactly what changed their calculation." My friend said later that she suspected his brother had consulted with his own attorney separately and been told that the documented involvement of the family LLC created significant legal exposure beyond the civil dispute, potential regulatory issues related to the attorney's conduct, possible fraud implications. Whatever the reason, the written acknowledgement arrived at 11:17 on a Saturday night, signed by him, notarized, attached to the settlement agreement. I signed the settlement the next morning. My friend came over and we sat at my kitchen island and she poured us both coffee and I signed my name and it was over, or it was almost over. His mother called my landline at noon on Sunday. I hadn't given her that number, he must have, and the fact that she was calling it at all told me she thought she was bypassing something, reaching me in a way my attorney hadn't anticipated. She said, "I know you think you've won something." I said, "I think I protected my financial interests, yes." She said, "You've made an enemy of this family and you don't understand what that means. My husband knows people. I know people. Your little design firm depends on clients, on reputation, on relationships. These things can be fragile." I let her finish. Then I said, "I'm recording this call. I've been recording it since you called. I'd like you to know that, and I'd like you to think carefully about whether you want to continue." There was a silence. Then she hung up. I sent the recording to my friend. She called back within 2 minutes and she was laughing, a little grimly. She said, "Okay, they're done. That's a threat of economic harm in connection with a legal dispute. They will never call you again." She was right. They didn't. The hardest part came later, in the ordinary aftermath, cancelling the vendors, calling people individually to tell them the wedding was off. The venue deposit was non-refundable. $1,400 I simply lost. The photographer was kind and released me from the contract. The florist kept $300 and wished me well in a way that felt genuine. My fiancé's mother had, over the previous year, steered nearly all of our vendor selections toward people she knew, which I had found thoughtful at the time and found differently now. It meant that every vendor call involved a version of being known as their future daughter-in-law and a version of not being that anymore. It was tedious and sad in the way that cleaning up after a flood is tedious and sad, not dramatic, just relentless. He reached out once more, about 3 weeks later. Not a call. An email. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't known the full extent of what his family had set up, and that he understood if I didn't believe him. He said he'd moved to his parents' place temporarily and was thinking about taking a position in Dallas with a firm that had been recruiting him for a year. He said he thought some distance from his family might be good for him. I believed some of it. I believed he hadn't known every detail. I also believed he had known there was something to not look at too closely, and that he had chosen not to look, There's a version of not knowing that is really choosing. I understood the difference by then, I replied once. I said I accepted his apology and that I hoped the Dallas opportunity worked out. I meant it. Then I closed the email and I didn't open another one from him. Here is what I did instead. I had a client at the time, a woman in her late 50s, a retired nurse who had recently left a long marriage and was redesigning her condo on the North Shore as an act of deliberate self-reclamation. She was cautious with decisions in a way I recognized. She second-guessed herself constantly, apologized for her preferences before she stated them, asked me 4 times whether I thought a certain paint color was foolish before choosing it. One afternoon she mentioned, almost in passing, that she hadn't known until her divorce proceedings that her name wasn't on the mortgage of the house she'd lived in for 22 years. Her husband had refinanced twice without telling her. The attorney who'd handled the original purchase had been a friend of his family. I sat with that for a long time after she left. I started making calls to my friend, to 2 other attorneys she knew who did consumer protection and financial fraud work, to a financial literacy educator I'd met at a Women in Business event 2 years earlier and never followed up with, to a real estate attorney who had nothing to do with anyone I'd ever dated and owed no loyalty to any family I was marrying into. What I found out, across those conversations, was that this was not uncommon. The specific mechanics varied. Sometimes it was title structure, sometimes it was debt run up in a partner's name, sometimes it was signing away rights to property in states where common law marriage created financial exposure people didn't know existed. But the pattern was consistent. One person going into a major financial commitment without independent representation, without complete information, without anyone in the room who was solely and exclusively on their side. What I started building, slowly at first, and then with more structure as I understood the shape of it, was a resource. I called it the Clear Title Project, not because it was only about property, but because the name felt right. The idea of seeing clearly, of having clean documentation of what was yours. The first event was a Saturday workshop in the conference room of my studio, 6 women, a real estate attorney, a family law attorney, and 2 hours of practical information about what to ask and what to read and what to insist on before signing anything. I charged nothing. 8 people showed up, which was more than I'd expected for something I'd announced with 2 weeks' notice and a flyer I designed myself at 10 at night. One of the women who attended had a signed contract in her purse that she'd been planning to finalize the following Monday. By the end of the workshop, she had 3 questions she hadn't known to ask. Her attorney called me the following Wednesday to say the contract had revealed a co-signature clause her fiancé's family had included without her knowledge, and that she'd requested its removal before proceeding. That phone call was the moment I understood what I was building. My friend joined as founding legal advisor. The financial literacy educator came on as a workshop facilitator. I used the settlement money, the $22,000 plus appreciation, as seed funding for the first year of operations. I registered the organization as a non-profit with the state of Illinois on a rainy Tuesday in January, sitting at my kitchen island with the brass fixtures I'd chosen and the white oak floors I'd laid and the candle I'd lit 100 times to help myself think. The Clear Title Project. I typed my name into the articles of incorporation and hit submit. By spring, we had a website. By summer, we had a waitlist for workshops. By the end of the year, we had 2 pro bono attorneys who took cases referred through our intake process, a partnership with a community college that offered our curriculum as part of their financial literacy certificate program, and a feature in Chicago Magazine's annual social innovation issue. My former fiancé did go to Dallas. I heard about it through mutual friends. I also heard, later, that the Hartwell LLC had been quietly dissolved after the settlement, and that his father had sold 2 investment properties the following year, under circumstances the mutual friends described as financially pressured, though I didn't know the details and didn't try to find them out. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, hearing that. It was something more neutral. The recognition that structures built on other people's resources without their knowledge tend to be less stable than they appear. His brother sent me a LinkedIn connection request 8 months after everything ended. I declined it without ceremony. His mother I never heard from again. The woman from the North Shore, my client with the mortgage she hadn't known about, came to our 1-year anniversary event. She'd finished her condo by then. She'd chosen the paint colour she'd apologized for wanting 4 times before. A deep slate blue that looked extraordinary in the afternoon light, and she'd stopped apologizing for her preferences in the 3 months since we'd finished the project. She brought a check to the event, a donation, and she handed it to me and said, "I want this to go to the youngest person you serve, whoever is the most at the beginning." I said I would make sure of it. She said, "The paint colour is right, by the way." "You were right," I said. "You chose it, you were right." She smiled. She said, "I guess I was." I was standing in my studio, which also served now as the Clear Title Project's home base on evenings and weekends, looking at the whiteboard where we tracked our active referrals and upcoming workshops, and the names of the pro bono attorneys who rotated through our case review process. It was a Thursday evening in November, more than a year after the rehearsal dinner at Rosewood. Outside the window, Michigan Avenue was already dark at 5 o'clock, the way it gets in Chicago. In November, the city lights reflected off the wet pavement in long, blurred streaks of gold and white. I thought about the closing day for the condo, the bow-tied attorney, the stack of documents, the word standard. I thought about my 23-year-old client who'd come to the workshop last month, newly engaged, and left with a list of 12 questions to bring to her own closing, and the name of an independent attorney who charged a flat fee for deed review. 12 questions. That was 2 more than I'd thought to ask. I turned off the lights in the studio and locked up. The night air was cold and smelled like rain on concrete, which is one of the smells I associate with Chicago in the way you associate a city with something that feels like home. My phone buzzed, a text from my friend. Schmidt Foundation just confirmed. Full grant. Enough to hire a full-time intake coordinator and fund 8 months of workshops. I stopped on the sidewalk. I read it twice. Then I typed back, "I'll call you tomorrow. Tonight I'm going to walk home and not think about anything for 20 minutes. She replied with a single emoji, a small flame. I put my phone in my pocket and I walked. The city moved around me, loud and indifferent and entirely mine to move through on my own terms. A year ago, I had walked out of a rehearsal dinner, not knowing what came next, only knowing I couldn't go back. I hadn't known about the LLC. I hadn't known about the management clause. I hadn't known how close I'd come to signing away the control I'd earned. What I'd had was 2 questions I was willing to ask out loud. It turned out that was enough to start with.